Very honored and thankful to Professor Jeff Sachs, who could not make it here because he's in New York with a very heavy schedule of other appointments, but we are happy to be able to speak to him live and be able to have questions at the end of his speech. It is very difficult to introduce somebody who is such a prolific writer, both an academic writer, but also a writer in mass media, a very influential person, both in terms of his academic work, but also in terms of policy intervention. I will try to make it very short and just say that Jeff Sachs is the Ketelec Professor of Sustainable Development at the Columbia University. He's also Professor of Health Policy and Management. He has been coordinating, he has been the director of the Earth Institute of Columbia University for 15 years. He has been special advisor to two UN Secretaries General, Ban Ki-moon and Kofi Annan, on the Millennium Goals. And he is coordinating, he's directing the global network of the United Nations on Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I think he's one of the most influential figures of our times, both in academia, but also in terms of applied policy. So I'm very glad to give him the floor and listen to his speech on the role of education for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the warm introduction, for the opportunity to be with you today. Could I ask you to turn the microphone down on your side so that I don't hear an echo in the back, if that's possible?
Yes, let me try to do that.
Great, thank you very much. Great, thanks a lot. It's really a delight to join you, and it's going to be an even bigger delight to join you in person in September when the SDSN for Greece has its conference on September 7 and 8. And so I'm looking forward to being in Athens in person, and looking forward to thanking you and seeing you in person. I want to talk about one particular dimension of research work that I think is extremely important for all of us, and especially for this association and the environmental and resource economists around the world. And that is a very applied kind of research to help the public and governments around the world understand the pathways to achieve the goals that we have universally agreed. Everybody is aware that at the end of 2015, in September, and again in December, the world unanimously agreed on an important set of sustainable development objectives. Of course, on September 25th, 2015, all 193 governments of the world at the UN agreed on the Agenda 2030 with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And then a few weeks after that, on December 12, 2015, the same 193 governments agreed on the Paris Climate Agreement. And these are interconnected. SDG number 13 incorporates the Paris Climate Agreement, whereas the Paris Climate Agreement explicitly says that climate control should be within the framework of sustainable development and of the 2030 Agenda. So actually, these two agreements, the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement, are really in a handshake together. They are part of the same global framework. Now, admittedly, my country, the United States, has recently gone rogue with a president who is basically out of control, Mr. Trump, who has said the United States will get out of the Paris Agreement. Don't lose heart. He does not speak for the American people. He certainly does not speak for American public opinion, which overwhelmingly is in favor of climate action and overwhelmingly is in favor of staying in the Paris Climate Agreement. Mr. Trump is in fact speaking for a small group of powerful interests, mainly the oil and gas lobby, which has spent about $100 million of campaign contributions in the 2016 election cycle. So it's basically, he's illustrating the corruption of American politics, not the substance of American interests or of American public opinion. And be sure we're going to fight it all the way, and we're going to win, because the broad American public is absolutely aghast at what Mr. Trump did, and we're not going to let it stand. So I'm going to take as given the hypothesis that the world has a consensus around Agenda 2030 and around the Paris Climate Agreement. And I want to emphasize the role for us as economists in actually helping to design the pathways to success of these goals. My claim is that it's not obvious by any means how to achieve these bold goals, neither the 17 Sustainable Development Goals nor the Paris Climate Agreement. And that in general, we need detailed systems modeling to understand the trajectories or the pathways of investment and regulatory action and pricing that would produce success in these goals. It's also my contention that most governments in the world have not done this homework, and most governments in the world by themselves cannot do this homework unless they're working together with you and with us, expert modelers, largely in universities, also in think tanks and in government research laboratories, that are absolutely needed to do the detailed analytics to show what are pathways to success. And really what I want to recommend is that we scale up the amount of practical, policy-oriented work that we are doing to show the trajectories of success for Agenda 2030 and for the Paris Climate Agreement. Let me discuss specifically first the Paris Climate Agreement. The goal in the Paris Climate Agreement, of course, is to keep global warming well below 2 degrees. Warming below 1.5 degrees C. We know from the climatology and from the ensemble of climate models that in order to achieve success of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees C, we have to keep cumulative greenhouse gas emissions below certain levels. And specifically for CO2 emissions, for carbon dioxide emissions, the cumulative CO2 emissions that would still be feasible and yet give the world a likely, for example, maybe 3/4 probability of staying well below 2 degrees C is very limited, perhaps 600 to 800 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions remaining in order to have a good likelihood of staying well below 2 degrees C. But since annual emissions are around 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, we're talking about perhaps 15 years left at the current level of carbon dioxide emissions. What this means, we know, is that the world has to move quickly to decarbonize the energy systems in every major region of the world, and to accomplish a complete decarbonization sometime around the year 2050. Well, that is a major challenge. How can we convert from an energy system that is 80% primary energy sourced on coal, oil, and gas to an energy system that is 100% non-emission of CO2 by mid-century? And how can we do this feasibly in each major region of the world and relatively low cost? That really is the big challenge. And I would argue that we don't really have enough models and enough case studies done in all parts of the world and at all scales, national certainly, but also subnational for major cities, and also regional for integrated regions like the European Union itself. What do we know about such pathways? We know that for all of the work that has been done on deep decarbonization, including the work of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, deep decarbonization depends on at least 3 basic pillars: energy efficiency, zero carbon power generation, and fuel switching from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, or to hydrogen vehicles and fuel cells, or to other kind of fuel switching, for instance, carbon capture and reuse technologies to make synthetic hydrocarbons. And similar fuel switching is needed in many industrial applications as well. So the basic framework of deep decarbonization, I think, is fairly well elucidated: energy efficiency, zero carbon power generation, and fuel switching. But we do not have detailed analytics in almost any part of the world to say, here are pathways that at low cost can accomplish this kind of transformation. There's a very interesting debate underway in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, for example, PNAS, a debate between Jacobson at Stanford University and many critics, arguing whether decarbonization is possible using only renewables, or let us say more specifically, solar, wind, and water, as opposed to a broader mix of technologies, including carbon capture and sequestration and nuclear energy. So there's a pretty raging debate in the United States. Can this be a just renewables pathway, or should we be integrating renewables with nuclear and carbon capture and sequestration, and perhaps even with bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration, so-called BECCS technologies for negative emissions? Well, that debate needs to be underway in all parts of the world. It's not good enough to solve this carbon question for just the United States, or just countries in Europe, or even for the European Union as a whole. we need to see that there are viable pathways for South Asia, for Northeast Asia, China, Japan, Korea, for Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, for Africa, for Latin America. And so I'm very, very much keen on us in universities creating a global network of studies on deep decarbonization. And I believe that for us to be practical in this, our models can't be black boxes using aggregate production functions that are not well specified on particular technologies. But we need models that are really technology based, integrating electric vehicles, nuclear energy, CCS, detailed studies of power grid management to see how intermittent energy and storage technologies need to be combined to find these underlying pathways. Well, I won't go into more detail except to stress that policymakers will be unable to proceed. And I believe in the United States, at least, we're going to get defeated politically by the powerful lobbies of coal, oil, and gas unless we can show coherently and convincingly the practical pathways to decarbonization and be able to give pricing for those pathways and costing, I should say, to ask what is the incremental cost relative to a fossil fuel economy, and to show that it's a very modest cost, which I believe it to be. Now, let me say more broadly that the SDG agenda and the energy agenda of the Paris Climate Agreement have many such very practical pathway analyses that need to be done. Another absolutely crucial pathway is the combination of SDG 2 on sustainable agriculture with SDG 6 on sustainable water management, with SDG 13 on climate control, with SDG 15 on terrestrial ecosystem conservation. Why do I say that? Because that's another mess of a problem. How can we have food security, water security, carbon management, and biodiversity conservation all in an integrated manner? I would say right now we don't really know. If you combine SDGs 2, 6, 13, and 15, we're really talking about a complex land use problem. How should land be allocated between agriculture, carbon storage, bioenergy, and biodiversity conservation? So far in that mix of challenges, we're not doing very well on any of them because we have massive loss of biodiversity, we have massive over-extraction of water, and our food systems are neither resilient nor sustainable in their current approach. So I believe we also need a complex set of studies, very practical, very technology-oriented, on how to combine the agricultural needs with the water, the carbon biological storage, and the biodiversity conservation challenges. And this has not quite been done yet. There's an even broader umbrella of problems, of course, which is how to achieve all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. That's a quite difficult problem of targets and instruments. 17 targets. Well, we know in economic theory we need 17 instruments in essence. We need ways that we can simultaneously achieve the various goals of water, food supply, health, education, job creation, biodiversity management, climate control, waste management for circular economy, so-called SDG 12, and so on. And finding that integrated structure is, of course, a kind of modeling that we're familiar with from the integrated assessment models, but we've not really created yet for the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me conclude by saying that the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which I'm proud to say includes University of Athens and includes so many wonderful world-leading universities throughout Europe, and in total now about 500 universities around the world. I believe that as a network, we have a special responsibility to show the practical pathways and the policy support of those pathways to achieve these complex and integrated objectives. But I think our work is really only starting on this. We have a lot of catching up to do. So the SDSN is championing three kinds of projects that I want to close by making you aware of. The first is deep decarbonization pathways. And we have had a deep decarbonization pathways project, and I want that to continue to increase the number of countries and the number of universities that are designing pathways of deep decarbonization. The second project we call FABLE, the Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land Use, and Energy Project, FABLE, which is to look at that integrated strategy for meeting food, water, climate, and biodiversity needs in a simultaneous, multi-objective manner. And the third big project we call the World in 2050, and that is the question, can we find pathways for every part of the world that are globally consistent through trade and through the global budget constraints on carbon and other challenges that meet sustainable development in all parts of the world? These are three projects that are ongoing. Please contact me directly for information about how you can get involved in those if you think that your university and you personally and your research team would like to be involved. I am absolutely available at sachs@columbia.edu. And please, I very much welcome the correspondence and the engagement with the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And finally, I want to remind you that we will have at the time of the UN General Assembly our annual International Conference on Sustainable Development that I want to warmly welcome all of you to New York and to the UN on that occasion. And that is September 18 to 21. And on September 20 and 21, we'll have 2 days of meetings on the low emissions solutions. So that will be specifically on the deep decarbonization pathways work. And I very much would welcome all of you there. Thank you again for letting me join the meeting. I hope I haven't run on too long, that you've been able to hear me clearly, but it really is a call from the heart that we be practical now to help governments understand how these goals can really be achieved and what we need to do in practical terms. And from a European perspective, let me add how a Europe-wide energy strategy that integrates the wind and the solar of the Aegean Sea, how the Mediterranean and the North Sea wind and solar can be integrated in a Europe-wide system so that we have an effective transformation to a low carbon and sustainable energy system. Well, thank you very much for letting me join, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. We could hear you very well. Let me also say that September 7 and 8, we are having the launch of the Greek SDSN, and the Greek SDSN is already working on a huge project in trying to collect 20 years of research in the country on the land allocation and ocean allocation towards sustainable development, and trying to merge existing work with ongoing work and collect everything on an open cloud, open access, available to everybody in order to facilitate scientifically led policy interventions with regards to the implementation of the SDGs. And we hope that we will be able to open this to Europe and then globally. If the Greek chapter is successful, then we might be able to increase the implementation of this project.
Bravo.
Now, thank you. I would like to take questions from the audience. Jeff, we have somebody that you know, Partha Dasgupta,
Okay,
and
great.
he wants to make a question. Please, Partha. Do you want to come up? Okay, we have a microphone in the audience.
Good morning, Jeff.
Partha, how are you?
Getting on. It's not so much a question, but a reflection on your wonderful talk and state a report, if you like. One of the two sessions were taking place at this meeting, where this network is collecting data and then creating indices for nations regarding the extent to which they achieve the 17 targets, how far off they are with the weighting systems. It's very quantitative, indicator-oriented estimations. And I thought that we should know about it because it's the start of a process by which you shame governments, but not doing the things that you are actually now asking governments to do, which is that identify policies and strategies towards meeting the SDGs. And I'm working backwards now. How do you get governments to take their responsibility seriously? And one way of doing that is to show how they're performing in regard to commitments that they have undertaken. So I really learned a lot from these discussions here. There were the presentations gave quantitative evidence of the extent to which different countries are falling short to date of their targets.
Oh, Partha, I'm sorry. The acoustics are really tough for me. I don't know if you could repeat it or if it could be repeated right into the microphone. It would help me, but I only caught every other word basically from the mic from the hall.
Why don't you try that out?
Yeah, basically, Partha said that during this conference, he attended sessions that tried to quantify how close different countries are to meeting the SDGs. And Partha suggests we start working backwards. We put it to the governments, you are so far away. I'm quoting Partha said, you can shame governments, you know, and then that could be the driving force to getting them into doing their job. So increasing awareness among people, but also letting the government know how far away they are and that people know that they are far away.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Let me say a couple of things about that. We are trying to produce a meaningful index of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. It's hard, obviously, for two reasons. One is its metrics over a multidimensional problem. And second, many of the variables of real interest, especially issues like biodiversity, are very poorly defined right now on comparable cross-country bases. But nevertheless, we produced last year for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network a first ever Sustainable Development Goal Index. And next week, we will actually release the second year report on that. And what we've done is essentially tried to come up either with direct or proxy indicators for each of the 17 SDGs, and then aggregate in the simplest possible way that each of the 17 goals is given an equal weight in an index that goes from 0 to 1, where 1 is completion of the goal and 0 is the worst observed case in the world. So the starting point from the one country most far behind. What we find is, not surprisingly, that for the high income countries, the big challenges are not the poverty related goals, but rather the fairness goals. For instance, SDG 10 on inequality, where we do have reasonably good measures through the Gini coefficient, for example. And of course, on the environmental side, where SDGs 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 are not in good shape. SDG 13 on carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, SDG 14 on marine ecosystem sustainability, and SDG 15 on terrestrial ecosystem sustainability. So we're trying to do this, and I agree with you completely that the sharper the metrics, the more accountability. But what I do also feel very much in countless discussions with governments is that they don't know how to achieve the goals. Most of them do not have the framework in order to do a transformation pathway and a policy analytics to say, how do we really get to where we need to go? And this is where I think practical modeling that is very attuned to the range of technological choices within reach is extremely important for us. As I've been emphasizing, whether it's technologies on food production or on energy production, or specific choices, for example, the role of beef in the diet, which we know to be the interface between food production and environmental sustainability, showing specifically how technological choices affect the ability to meet these goals is a big help to governments. The United States never made a plan until very recently, until the end of the Obama administration. Now it's been thrown out by the Trump administration, but never even made a scenario for how to decarbonize the US economy. And outside of Europe, very few countries have actually made such scenario analytics to this point. So we need the metrics, the naming, shaming, the public awareness, and the pathway analysis, I would say.
Very good, yes. And also nature-based solutions could have a say in this equation, which is the keynote speech of tomorrow morning, nature-based solutions. Any other question? Yes, please. Please come up. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Misa Tanaka from the Bank of England, and I have a question about the extent of modeling that's been done on employment transition, because I think one of the main driver of US policy recently has been, in part, the worry about employment loss. And I just wanted to have maybe on that aspect of modeling.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there is good reason to believe that we are in a very special technological period where machines and artificial intelligence and robotics are creating a sharp downward shift in the demand for certain kinds of labor. And it's pretty clear that in most of our economies, demand for basically low-skilled labor and especially work in the goods-producing sectors to this point have really experienced a sharp structural transformation. In the United States, we haven't had an increase of wages of high school graduates for more than 35 years now, even though the GDP per capita is soaring. So, in other words, there's been a big shift of the income distribution, both to highly skilled labor and to capital, to ownership of capital. And the demand for lower skilled work has declined in absolute terms. And so there's a real break between the tradition that a rise of average labor productivity and the wage go hand in hand, keeping the labor share value roughly constant. And I think, again, we haven't really done a good job of mapping specific kinds of technological change, in this case, the information revolution, to the changes of demand for different kinds of labor or shifts in the functional income distribution between labor and capital. Of course, this has now become a very popular area of study, and it's a hard one because looking backward may not be very helpful for looking forward. And that's my own view. I think there's going to be a very sharp shift against labor relative to capital in the coming years, because I think it's not only low-skilled jobs that are going to be substituted by smart machines, but our jobs too, and a very wide swath of jobs. So the question of employment, and that's actually one of the SDGs also, decent work is SDG 8. This is a very big question of employment in the face of robotics, smart machines, artificial intelligence, and I highly recommend it as a research program, but it's quite speculative because I believe we're seeing in advance of technologies that one can analogize with the past improvements of machines, but I think are really going to have a different effect because a lot of basically information-rich work is now going to fall under the domain of smart machine systems. My own view is that the implication of this is that we're going to need more redistribution of income from capital to labor. And of course, we're moving in the other direction in the United States in recent years. We need to tax capital more and redistribute it towards labor. That's also taxing the older generation more, which owns the capital, and redistributing it towards younger people who are facing more structural unemployment. And I also believe, broadly speaking, just like Keynes wrote about in 1930 in his famous essay on the economic possibilities for our grandchildren, that we are entering in a period where we will take more of our increased living standards in the form of leisure and less in the form of work, because machines really can do more of the work. But modeling that transition has not been done very effectively. I personally have a research group working on modeling the United States with a specific focus on how information technology will affect the production functions in 18 major sectors of the economy. So I'm trying to downscale it to an 18 sector computable general equilibrium framework, but adding in a rather specific attention to e-commerce and smart systems, e-finance, e-governance, and so forth, to get a better feel for what this means for the future income distribution and nature of jobs and leisure.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm afraid I cannot take any more questions because we are delaying the parallel sessions now. We are 15 minutes over our time. I want to thank you again for, as always, a very clear and motivating lecture. Thank you for waking up at 1:30 to speak to us. We really appreciate that. And let's keep on the good work.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.